Welcome to Comparative Constitutional Law, the last lecture in statsrett in JUS2111. Every day in Norwegian newspapers, you can read stories about comparative constitutional law, often from the United States of America. But that's not all. You can also find stories from India and Poland in relation to their apex or supreme or constitutional courts. My name is Malcolm Langford, Professor at the Department for Public Law and Director of CEL, Centre for Experiential Legal Learning. And with me in the lecture will be Beate Berger, who is an advocate at Kluge and a former student leader at CEL. In this brief video, we're going to be looking at the plan for the lecture, but also introduce you to why we should be interested in comparative constitutional law. Importantly, we're going to be using English in this lecture because that's the language we often use today to compare courts, jurisprudence, and other constitutional issues from different countries. So, the lecture, which we'll be having in a few days, will focus on the why, what, and how of comparative law, systems of government with a particular focus on presidential and parliamentary systems, and we'll look a little bit closely at the difference between negative and positive parliamentarism, which is core to the Norwegian model. Then we'll be going over to judicial review of legislation, and then how do we amend constitutions. The teaching plan is read the article or the equivalent pages in Ivan Smith's textbook, watch this brief video, and then join the live Zoom lecture. So, in the rest of this video, I'm going to ask the question, why comparative constitutional law? Why bother to read the article? Why bother to turn up to the lecture? There's two types of reasons we can think about for studying comparative constitutional law. One is more internal to the legal community, and one is more external. Firstly, the internal. The legal participant, you as a lawyer or law student, within a legal discourse. Firstly, we might be interested in comparative constitutional law because we want to change our own constitutional law or practices, and we look to other countries for inspiration. We might also want to improve legal interpretation. Many constitutions today contain exactly the same provisions, particularly in bills of rights. We might be eager to find the best interpretation out there in the world, or perhaps more modestly, the view from elsewhere, to see how other countries have interpreted the right to freedom of expression or the right to social security. In some cases, comparative constitutional law may even be a legal doctrine or source. For example, in determining what is the European consensus in European Court of Human Rights cases, we may need to go to constitutional law of all the Council of Europe states to determine what is today's European consensus, for example, on abortion rights or voting. In some countries, comparative law is also a formal legal source. You can find that in the South African Constitution, for example. Finally, comparative constitutional law can help us understand better Norwegian constitutional law. It acts as a mirror so that we can see perhaps things we haven't seen before. It's just like ourselves as human beings. It's often when we meet other people, we understand ourselves better. When we engage in comparative law, looking at what other countries do, we often get a better understanding of our own law. Let's take some examples of legal reform and self-understanding. For example, when the Norwegian Constitution was drafted in 1814, it was inspired by comparative law. Christian Adolf Dirks looked closely at, for example, the new American Constitution, the French Declaration, the Spanish Constitution of 1812, as well as the Swedish constitutional setup. And it influenced significantly the Norwegian Constitution. More recently, with the 2014 reform of the Norwegian Constitution, particularly in relation to a reformed and updated Bill of Rights, the Finnish Constitution had a significant influence, and that was the one country that the Commission visited when they drafted the new Bill of Rights for discussion. Secondly, another example as to how foreign law might help us understand better Norwegian law. You might remember there was a major campaign in Spain for independence of Catalonia, an attempt to have secession. The Spanish Constitution prohibits secession of any of the regions from Spain, and in fact imposes significant criminal penalties or prison penalties for attempts to secede. Catalonia got a lot of sympathy from Norwegian journalists and portions of the Norwegian public. However, the Catalonia moment provided a good example to learn Norwegian law, because in the Norwegian Constitution, in Article 1, it is also prohibited to divide up the Norwegian kingdom. And moreover, when we look at the criminal law, significant prison penalties are imposed on those who seek to agitate for secession in Norway. So, for example, if Finnmark tried to be a separate country, as some have proposed, if there was a serious agitation for this, like in Catalonia, then Finnmark representatives or agitators could face significant jail time. So the Catalonia example provided an opportunity for many of us to explain to the Norwegian public, well, Spain is not so much different from Norway, for better or worse. A second reason to study comparative constitutional law is more an external one, more academic in orientation. We might be interested in simply gaining knowledge and understanding. What is happening in the US? What is happening in Poland? How does it shape our world? Or we might be interested in more empirical and social scientific analysis. How can we understand the origins of constitutions, describe and explain how they're used, predict future outcomes? And by looking at many other constitutions, we can understand better both the Norwegian constitution and other constitutions and how they operate in a broader context. And to give you one practical example of an empirical approach, I have a recent article looking at the impact of putting the human right to water in constitutions. We do a quantitative analysis and we find two things. Firstly, simply putting the right to water in the Constitution doesn't mean you're going to get an improvement in access to water. However, when there is good democratic governance in a country, or better democratic governance, which means not just democracy, but also rule of law, judicial independence, then putting the right to water in the Constitution actually has an impact. It means that judges can actually implement it in concrete cases. It inflects and impacts the political debate and can influence policies. So that's one example where we learn about the impact of putting a particular right in the Constitution, and that can also influence debates around legal reform. That's all from me, and look forward to seeing you in the lecture along with Beata.